My name is Danielle Kellogg, and I'm a sixth-year PhD student in the social psychology program. Today I'm going to talk about a study we conducted where we looked at perceived harm and intent predicting women's attributions of their partner's sexism. And specifically, I'm interested in ambivalent sexism. According to ambivalent sexism theory, there are two complementary forms of sexism that work together to promote gender inequality. The first being hostile sexism, which is blatant and negative and involves things like hiring discrimination and sexual harassment. And these attitudes are driven by the assumption that women are seeking to gain power over men. So by using control, violence, and intimidation, hostile sexism keeps women in their place. And it is generally more common in contexts where women and men are competing for resources, such as the workplace or even in public places like on the street. However, when you're in a close relationship, and specifically if we're thinking about heterosexual romantic relationships, there is a degree of interdependence. And in these contexts, we tend to see benevolent rather than hostile sexism. This is a subjectively positive form of sexism, including things like stereotyping women as being nurturing or good mothers, unsolicited helping behavior, and even things we see on TV or movies that are packaged as chivalry. People don't generally view benevolent sexism as sexist, and many women endorse these attitudes themselves, but it's used as a reward to reward those women who are conforming to traditional gender roles. And so both hostile and benevolent sexism in different ways are helping undermine women's goal pursuit and ultimately maintain societal gender inequalities. As I mentioned, benevolent sexism is more common in relationships, and this is partially because people are idealizing those attitudes, and we're socialized to look for a Prince Charming. But women often endorse and accept these attitudes themselves, and Hammond and colleagues found that this occurs over time. So if I perceive that my partner is endorsing benevolent sexism, over time, my own endorsement of benevolent sexism is going to match theirs. And this is true whether you look at their male partner's actual or perceived benevolent sexism. And so there's something about the relationship context that is changing women's attitudes rather than maybe their own volition. But what we see is that in the long run, both hostile and benevolent sexism in relationships is negatively impacting women's relationship outcomes. Specifically, this is because of the fact that benevolent sexism is prescribing rigid expectations for how both men and women are expected to act. And if men fail to be that perfect Prince Charming, what happens is that women who are endorsing benevolent sexism, if there's problems or conflict in their relationship, they are more likely to be dissatisfied and even want to end their relationship compared to women who don't endorse these attitudes. Basically, benevolent sexism and as well as hostile sexism is negatively impacting women's relationships. And even the types of support that benevolently sexist men and women give is so different that it negatively affects women's relationship outcomes. Specifically, benevolently sexist men give support to their female partners that undermines their competency and goal pursuit, whereas the types of support that benevolently sexist women give to their male partners helps them to reach their goals. And even beyond the relationship context, we know that exposure to sexism is linked to negative outcomes like anxiety, depression, body image concerns. Other work has shown that while women actually report similar anger after experiencing benevolent and hostile sexism, that there's differences in how they respond cardiovascularly, such that when you experience hostile sexism, you're angry, but there's this heightened reactivity. And so the stress response is really strong and quick, and you get over it. In contrast, when women experienced benevolent sexism, they're equally as angry, but they have a prolonged cardiovascular recovery. So they're kind of ruminating and they're not getting over it as fast. And so that can be really damaging as a stress response just to your physical health, but also your mental health. And so for some reason, women are able to get over hostile sexism more quickly, and that may be because it is more prototypical and therefore easier to attribute or label as sexist. And work shows that it's not only the types of behaviors that matter, it's also if the perpetrator is more prototypical. So if we look at anti-Black racism, the prototypical perpetrator is often a white person, so you're more likely to attribute their anti-Black racism. Even if we look at the roles people are playing, we're more likely to attribute sexism if it's from a boss or a stranger rather than a relationship partner. And so that's one thing that's influencing whether people are attributing sexism. But generally, outside of the relationship, Oswald and colleagues found that women experience benevolent sexism more frequently than hostile sexism, but they perceive benevolent sexism as less distressing and less sexist. And so I was wondering if that might be something that we see happen even within relationships. And this is also related to this idea that work has found perceived harm and perceived intent positively relate to attributions. So the more harmful I perceive the behavior, or the more intentionally sexist I perceive the actor, that's going to make it more likely that I'll attribute their behavior. And generally, when we're looking at perceived harm and intent and looking at differences between hostile and benevolent sexism, we see that people do perceive hostile sexism as more harmful and more intentional, and they see perpetrators of benevolent sexism, who are typically like relationship partners, as less intentionally sexist, and they often attribute different intent, like intent to be intimate rather than intent to be sexist. So generally, it looks like these differences in attributing hostile and benevolent sexism are able to be explained by perceived harm and perceived intent judgments. Even within the relationship context, remember that people idealize benevolent sexism. They want this Prince Charming, and we also have motivation, these motivated cognitions, to perceive our partners in a positive light, to explain away potential problems. And if it's something ambiguous like benevolent sexism, it's really easy to find another explanation rather than saying that it is sexist. Even so, I expect that perceived harm and intent might explain this difference in attributing partner sexism if we do in fact find that women are more likely to attribute one form over the other. And my general hypotheses were, first, that women would perceive benevolent sexism more frequently than hostile sexism, and then that they would perceive or rate their partner's hostile sexism as more harmful, more intentional, and more sexist, meaning they're attributing it more, compared to their partner's benevolent sexism, in line with what that previous research found. And for this study, we had a final sample of 128 women. They had to be in a monogamous heterosexual romantic relationship of at least 2 months. On average, they were about 43 years old and had been in about 15-year relationships. So obviously different from if we had done a participant pool sample. And you can see from the pie charts that for race, it is much heavily skewed towards white participants. It was 84% white, so that's one thing to just pay attention to in this. But we also had a good mix of married, engaged, or dating people. So again, just a bit different of a sample. They were recruited from Amazon MTurk using Cloud Research Prime panels, and they were told that this was an online study about romantic relationships. We administered the survey on Qualtrics, and we used counterbalancing to show them different descriptions of partner sexism, and this is a repeated measures design. So they saw different descriptions of partner sexism, and we told them, read this description and then respond to these questions as if we're talking about your current partner, and we're just looking at typical behavior. We didn't tell them that it's sexist. And these descriptions are based off of items from the ambivalent sexism inventory, and they were pilot tested and revised with research assistants in our lab. And after each description, as I said, it was counterbalanced. So you would see one description, and then you would see 4 questions. And then you would see the next description and the same 4 questions. And these questions are related to the hypotheses that I said. So how frequently does your current partner treat you this way, from never to all the time, as frequency? These behaviors are harmful to women, not at all to very much so for perceived harm. These behaviors are intended to be sexist, not at all very much so for perceived intent. And then finally, for attribution, to what extent are these behaviors sexist, from not at all to very much so? And we conducted a series of paired samples t-tests to evaluate each of those ratings and see if they differed for the types of sexism. And I put it all in one graph just so it's easier to digest, but essentially what we found is that for frequency, women are perceiving benevolent sexism significantly more frequent than hostile sexism, in line with our prediction, and that for the other 3 bars, they're perceiving their partner's benevolent sexism as significantly less harmful, less intentional, and they're less likely to attribute it compared to their partner's hostile sexism, again in line with our predictions as well as previous research, suggesting that women are perceiving and attributing different forms of partner sexism differently, but in a similar manner to what they would see in general. And I also did a bit of exploratory correlation analyses because I was interested in specifically those variables or ratings that were related to attribution. So just the bottom row here. And so what we see is that frequency of partner benevolent sexism is significantly negatively related to attribution. And that makes sense if people are, in fact, internalizing these attitudes and endorsing them themselves and kind of adapting to them over time. However, what I was interested in is whether harm and intent are related to attribution. And we see that both harm and intent are significantly positively related to attribution. So the more that I perceive partner benevolent sexism as harmful and intentional, the more likely that I attribute it. And that makes sense because if they're perceiving less harm and intent from those behaviors, that also means, as a positive correlation, that they're less likely to attribute it. And then when we looked at hostile sexism, frequency was not related to attribution, which makes sense because people generally perceive these behaviors as sexist regardless of how often they experience it. But again, we're seeing a significant positive correlation between harm and attribution and intent and attribution. So again, the more I perceive my partner's hostile sexism as harmful and intentional, the more I am going to attribute that. And so generally, we're seeing that women are perceiving and attributing different forms of partner sexism differently, and our correlation data is telling us that perceived harm and intent appear to be important predictors of whether women attribute partner sexism, but that frequency is less of a universally important predictor. And so some of the strengths here is that we did use counterbalancing, so we can be confident that these did not occur due to order effects. We also replicated previous work in this new context within the relationship. However, because it's self-report, there is potential retrospective biases, and then the overwhelming amount of white participants makes it questionable if this is a representative sample. And so I'm currently conducting a follow-up or kind of additional data collection using the participant pool just to see if we get different results or the same. And in the future, I want to manipulate perceived harm and or perceived intent. And finally, to see if I can maybe have people do face-to-face interactions rather than just self-report. And finally, I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Tracy DeHart, as well as the Self and Social Interaction Lab for all of their help. My undergraduate research mentee, Eva Baer, was also extremely helpful. And then finally, the graduate school for funding this project through the research mentoring program. And I'm excited to hear questions and